Hi, I'm Laura Marsh. I'm the literary editor of The New Republic. Thank you for coming. This is part of a series of events hosted by The New Republic here at the Strand, where we talk to authors of new books. Tonight, I'm very excited to be here with Anna Wiener, the author of Uncanny Valley, a memoir. We are selling copies of the book here tonight, and Anna will be signing them at the end, so make sure you pick one up. So this is a book about your life in tech, moving to Silicon Valley and everything you saw there. I realized that I've known you for several years before you started writing this book, and I felt like I've been hearing about your life in Silicon Valley, and I have to admit I didn't really believe you often. Or I would think, that's an exaggeration. Seltzer at work's great, but what's a ripstick? Never heard of one. And then I went to San Francisco, and you gave me a tour, and we saw a group of guys on Segways. There were 8 guys wearing gray suits. Am I remembering that right?
They were wearing a shirt. Many of them were wearing shirts with a company logo, like a polo shirt with the logo of a VC venture capital firm.
I didn't even recognize that this was branded workwear, company.
This was a team building activity. This was an adult team building exercise.
And you're oh, guys, these guys are doing a team building Segway tour. And then I was maybe everything Anna's told me was true. It's just an understatement. This is really what it's
everything has been an understatement. Everything has been a gentle, watered down version of what's going on.
Right. As I've learned, there's so much more of it. So we're going to start with a reading, and then we're going to talk more about the book.
Thank you. I liked how you looked at the book as though you had forgotten the title. Yeah.
No, I just thought I needed to display it.
Okay. I have a sort of complicated... I'm going to read 2 sections of the book, one from fairly early on and one from a little bit later. And I have notes to myself. Okay, this is just going to be a real free-for-all. I was employee number 20 and the 4th woman. Prior to my arrival, the solutions team, 4 men, including my manager, had handled customer tickets themselves, attacking the support queue in shifts at the end of the workday, relaying the responsibility to avoid consecutive office-bound midnights. The strategy was effective for a while, but the user base was ballooning. The men couldn't sustain the practice. They had their own jobs to do. They rearranged their desktop belongings and cleared a space for me. The men on the solutions team weren't like the men from the ebook startup, where I had worked previously. They were weirder, wilder, funnier, harder to keep up with. They wore Australian work boots and flannel, and durable recycled polyester athletic vests, drank energy shots in the late afternoon, and popped a vitamin D in the mornings to stay focused and alert. They chewed powdered Swedish tobacco, packing it juicily behind their gums. Deep house and EDM leaked from their oversized headphones. At team gatherings, they drank whiskey neat, and the following mornings were prone to pounding a viscous liquid jacked up with electrolytes, sold as a remedy for small children with diarrhea, to flush away their hangovers. They had gone to top-tier private colleges and were fluent in the jargon of media studies and literary theory. They reminded me of my friends who had left San Francisco, but more adaptable and opportunistic, happier. I began wearing flannel. This is really only 20 pages later, so it's... I began wearing flannel. I bought Australian work boots and biked to work in them, sweating. I incorporated B vitamins into my regimen and felt more awake, more cheerful. I began dipping into EDM. It was a vestige of Burning Man that never went out of season in the Bay Area, like ecstatic dance or LED-studded sculptures or psychedelic leggings. Listening to EDM while I worked gave me delusions of grandeur, but it kept me in a rhythm. It was the genre of my generation, the music of video games and computer effects, the music of the 24-hour hustle, the music of proudly selling out. It was decadent and cheaply made, the music of a history or globalization, or maybe nihilism, but fun. It made me feel like I had just railed cocaine, except happy. It made me feel like I was going somewhere. Was this what it felt like to hurtle through the world in a state of pure confidence, I wondered, pressing my fingers to my temples? Was this what it was like to be a man? The sheer ecstasy of the drop made everything around me feel like part of a running shoe ad or a luxury car commercial, though I couldn't imagine driving to EDM or even online shopping. I couldn't imagine playing it for my parents. I would lean against my standing desk and dance while pounding out emails, nodding in solidarity with the rest of the team. My feet may as well have been turning the world.
Thank you. So in that part of the book, you have just arrived at your second job at a startup, but your first job in Silicon Valley, the data analytics company. Mm-hmm. You're a writer now, and you've been a writer before you moved out there, right? So how did you end up in this strange place and among these people?
Does it seem inconsistent? I was working at a literary agency in my early 20s and was writing sad personal essays about Renata Adler in New York and my grandfather and being lonely in Greenpoint. And
that's not a gag.
That's not a joke. And I felt like my career there was no career. I was an assistant, and I could probably be an assistant for a very long time, but the trajectory available to me was basically a dead end. And I wanted something to do that felt like it had momentum or that was useful in some way or just that had a future. I was really excited about the prospect of having a future at work and elsewhere, but especially at work. Mm-hmm. And so I learned about this ebook startup on the Paris Review blog and emailed them hungrily this 4-paragraph email that was like, I will do anything to work for you. They had raised $3 million, so I was like, this is the future, 100%. And I wrote this sad, it would be an honor to work for you. I will be a copywriter, a product manager, a marketer. I think I just looked up what are job titles. And it's I am available for all of these things. And by the way, I love to read. Mm-hmm. And they didn't respond. And I followed up. And I think they were testing me because this is the thing that people do. It's if they follow up, they're
really
serious.
Want it?
Yeah. And so I sort of stumbled into tech in that way and then stayed.
Mm-hmm. And the ebook startup, you start to experience some of this culture there, right? But it really, you really immerse yourself in it when you move to San Francisco.
Yes.
And you were excited about that.
Yeah.
You bought the flannel shirts, you bought the work boots.
They're incredibly comfortable. They're so comfortable if all you do all day is stand on a rubber mat and answer emails.
But at the same time, it feels like even early in the book, you have this thing of wanting to build a life and to some extent redefine yourself by the work you're doing. But then also experiencing the culture in Silicon Valley and realizing that you can't just kind of do it a little bit. You have to go the whole hog and really invest in this.
You have to be down for the cause.
Down for the cause. Okay, yeah. Explain what down for the cause means, because that's a big part of this book.
Yeah. The book is actually called Down for the Cause. Down for the Cause was a sort of internal company slogan at this company that I went out to work for in San Francisco. And we had, the acronym in our conference room and these little metal letters that you might buy at Target. And it meant basically committing to the company, being available to do work outside of your job domain or your title, being able to stay late, basically doing everything you could to keep it moving. Mm-hmm. And so I was extremely down for the cause. I think just sort of seduced by the idea that this was different, that this was a work environment that meant something and that was, going to be world historical in some way.
Mm-hmm. Did you ever find out what the cause was? This is just an editor's question. What is can we be more specific here?
What was define your terms?
The success of the company, I assume.
Right. The cause was the company.
But it also was more than that.
Would you like me to read the section in the book that asks what was the cause? The cause of the company, the cause was acceleration. It was growth. It was getting the product into the hands of as many people as possible. I mean, if you really start to analyze that, it's like, okay, what does that mean? What's the end of that story? To what end? And the product was a product analytics tool, which is a word that I still have trouble saying in good faith. And it helped other companies with digital products collect data on their users. So that was then filtered back into dashboards that our company offered. So at the end of the idea was this world in which everything was quantified, controlled, monetized, organized, and streamlined, optimized. So I guess the cause was the company, but if you really dig into that, the cause was this frictionless world.
So many parts of the book have this kind of language which is English, but is terms that people are using there that I don't come across in my line of work here in New York. Can you talk to us about God mode?
Sure. I'm just curious, as an aside, did you encounter any of that language when the New Republic was briefly taken over by Chris Hughes, former founder of Facebook?
No, I think there was some tech stuff, like move fast and break things. There's a tech thing, right? So there was a CEO at one point who said that. But no, I think I thought that I was in a really techie environment.
Yeah.
But then I read your book and I was like, oh God, I'm so this is like the 90s over here. I wish there was a God mode for editors. Sadly, there's not.
I think it's just like chart beat.
I thought it was track changes or something. That would be God mode. Wow, I'm really inside this piece.
Sending an editor something when you haven't accepted all changes on your own work, it's a nightmare.
If you didn't reject
revealing.
them, it's okay.
We can talk about this later. And I also would like to talk later about what it means for the New Republic to move fast and break things. That's not a model you want for
I'm not the person
journalism.
to talk to you about that. So God mode.
So God
what do you
mode.
see in God mode?
This was a colloquialism that we used to talk about a feature called impersonate, which meant it basically allowed us, and I was doing customer support, to see the data sets that our customers were gathering on their users. So it was kind of this amazing living archive of this is grandiose. Never mind. I was going to say sociological archive. It was a ton of data on how people were using apps and websites. And I thought this was fascinating. And it was also, you could sort of just go in and take a look on, see, oh, this company I just read about, how are they doing? What are they doing? What does their data set look like? Can we help them collect more data or different data or whatever? And so that was an education because it was both a way of sort of looking at narrative about these different businesses and how also narrative about how people were using the internet and using apps, but also just a sort of wonderful way to see the distance between a lot of the media coverage of these companies at the time and how we saw them to actually be faring.
Right, and sense. Around the time that you were working there, or maybe just after you left, there were the Snowden revelations about the NSA, and you start feeling more like maybe huge databases aren't good.
You mean privately held, indefinitely stored databases on human behavior that people don't know are being collected on
right.
Yeah, it could be controversial. The Snowden revelations came out, I think, my second month on the job. And it took me a really long time to connect the dots that there was a surveillance economy, that there was, obviously, the NSA and product analytics are not the same thing. There's a huge spectrum in between them, or maybe it's more of an ecosystem. But I had not been thinking about mass surveillance or about data in any nefarious way or data being used to disenfranchise people or to exploit or take advantage of the vulnerable. I was thinking of data as in the terms of the industry, which was what's your moonshot metric and how do we what's your northern
moonshot
star?
Metric.
So It took me a while, and it took the prodding of some friends to point out that perhaps what we were doing was related to other trends socially that were worth
could be used in bad ways. Well, I guess I'm getting ahead of myself because first I want to ask you I want to go back to this mood of optimism that came through in the first reading. It was at first the office culture, and it seemed really exciting, and you have this wonderful description of the opulence and decadence of the office. So what is decadence in like a startup?
I mean, for me, decadence, like I'm someone who started my first job in publishing, and I didn't know what people did for lunch in an office. And so I went to the bodega up Prince Street and got a can of vegan chicken noodle soup and brought it back to the office and microwaved it. I was so impressed that they had their own bowls and plates. And then the whole office smelled like vegan chicken noodle soup. Like,
yeah, you wouldn't have been my favorite person if we would work together.
I never did it again. Canned soup in the office. But there's also an office of like 7 people. It was conspicuous. Decadence to me was, we were this company of 20, and the office space was gigantic. And we didn't need it yet, but it was there as a reminder that we were going to grow and we were going to get big, and that there was no doubt about that. And so there was, all of this food and all of these drinks, and there was booze, and we'd have sort of parties / events every month. And I think what I mean by decadence is a budget, is working for a company that doesn't just have money, but has too much money, and spends it extravagantly. I mean,
but it's interesting what you just said about the perks being there to show that we're going to be successful. Because I had always thought of those kind of tech company perks, like catered lunches, seltzer, ping pong, beers that anyone's allowed to pick up, but like shouldn't before 5, and everyone observes that. I always thought of those things as stuff that was put in place to like retain employees, or to back up this argument that like coding is so hard and so intense that you have to just like give everyone everything that they need to stay alive at all times so that they can just code even more and for even longer. But what you're saying is like a much more subtle argument, which is like you don't need any of this stuff, but you have it to just kind of show that like this is a real tech company, and we're going to become, we're going to disrupt the thing that we're trying to do.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what I just described vis-a-vis opulence was the more, the leaner of the 2 startups that I worked for in San Francisco. I agree that a lot of these perks are superficial, and they don't constitute company culture, but they are, they help retain employees. And when you kind of amplify that, when I moved to my second job in San Francisco, it was sort of like turning the dial like all the way to the right and then like breaking the dial off the stereo. And
does that mean lots of perks?
It was, yeah.
So I remember you like emailed me once, and you were like, "Oh, just had to go into a sleep pod to write that." I was like, "What?"
It's actually called a coder cave, and it's a sensory deprivation. Not chamber. Sorry, that's a whole other thing. It's a dark pod where you can go in the middle of the day and lie on some cushions and just like hope no one's had sex in it.
I really hope they didn't. For your sake, writing that email to me. It was just like right when you get home.
But the second place I worked in San Francisco, I actually don't even understand the motivations behind it. I think they just could. But we had a room that was a replica of the Oval Office. And so...
Did people work in there, or it was just like a set?
It was reception. It was the first thing you saw when you walked in.
I'm really struggling to envision that. So when you walked in, there was an oval-shaped room.
Envision the Oval Office. It's that. And yeah, the entrance was through the Oval Office.
Okay, but the president is the person in the Oval Office, not the person who sits at reception being like, would you like to see the president?
Well, I think that there were some people who thought this was sort of subversive to have this like a lovely, friendly female office manager sitting at the Oval Office desk. Anyway, this is the era of lean in. This is, peak corporate feminism. I think she was referred to as Madam President. Everyone had a lot of nicknames. Doesn't matter. But I do think that these, I think that at a certain point, the playfulness of these workplaces and the perks, and you're just constantly stuffing your face with like really nice food or not that nice food, but it's there. So you're just like a bird at a bird feeder, like putting your mouth up against the granola, just letting it come in. And I think that a lot of that can be a cover for, this playfulness can be a cover for a few different things. One is the actual seriousness and the consequences of some of this work and the responsibility that people have to work on these products, but also my pet theory, which has no one has picked up on or nobody seems to like, but I'm going to say it again, is that I think it offsets the maybe psychological burden of working on things that are intangible. And especially for engineers, working on things that get erased all the time, rewritten, working on products that never ship. Committing a lot of your life to things that don't exist in the world have a lot of power often, but you can't touch or manipulate physically. So maybe that's why there are slides and zip lines, but I've never seen a zip line in an office that didn't feel incredibly sad. Just like droopy,
Right.
Can't transport a body.
You talk also about the culture of people going hiking a lot and going on like camping trips together, and the idea that people who are in these offices doing intangible work seem to spend most of their spare time trying to do as many physical kind of like survivalist things as possible.
I think that might be a California thing. Like, I don't know. I would like to know, do people who work at Facebook and Google in New York go outside, or do they just go to Equinox and like have a really nicely scented workout? I suspect they go to Equinox. I'm seeing a nod in the audience from an engineer front. So I'm going to take that sample of one as
Did someone vote for Equinox? I missed it. Okay. So also you talk about, to go back to Madame President and the way women are treated in these companies, you talk a lot in the book about being often one of the only female employees in the startups you worked in. But it's not the main theme of the book. And I wondered how you approached like weaving that in.
I wove it in a way that I wanted. My intention was to be honest to my own experience, or honest about my own experience. When I had the book out on submission and was talking to publishers about it, I got the sense from a few of them that they were like kind of, are you sure you weren't sexually harassed or assaulted a little bit more? And I felt like these are important stories that people are telling in Silicon Valley and about Silicon Valley, but I didn't want to overstate my own experience or diverge from my own perception of what was happening at the companies I worked for, in part because I wanted it to feel in the book the way it felt in real life, which was sexism was pervasive, and I thought about it all the time, but there didn't need to be some like inciting incident for that to feel, present around every corner. And so I do think that, I know a lot of people who've had horrendous experiences in tech and also outside of tech, a lot of women having horrendous experiences all over the place, but I didn't feel that it was appropriate to use my book as a vehicle for those stories in depth. And it's something I still think about, because I wonder, should I have gone harder on this, or should I have let it be sort of like wallpaper for the book as it was for my experience?
Well, the other part of your experience is being a non-technical employee. So the excerpt you just read is about working in support. One of the books that I know you've really there's been a lot to you over the years is the Ellen Ullman's book, Life in Code, and that's about being an engineer, whereas this book is about being a non-technical employee. And that seems like a big part of like the lens for seeing Silicon Valley. Like you're in it, but you're not, like at the apex of it. Do you want to talk more about that?
Yeah, I think that the non-technical work is also related to gender, related to sexism, as it's often, soft-skilled work is often coded as as female. It's often coded as obviously lower level work, although I will say, like, trying to hire a copywriter who can write about data in a way that anyone wants to read is impossible. And if you have that skill set, you should be able to command like $160,000 a year, but will command about $60,000 a year. Like, so there's a whole hierarchy, I think, that privileges engineering skills, but the soft skill designation is also a way to undermine or undervalue labor that's often being done by women or other underrepresented minorities in the industry. So they're sort of inextricable. I'm not quite sure what your question was. I'm so sorry.
No, that was lovely. Okay. I think, so we have another reading.
Yeah.
So why don't
it's
you
short.
Go ahead with
Read
that.
it?
Yeah.
Back in San Francisco, I felt acutely aware of the city's beauty and of the inbound aesthetic shift. Half the knowledge workers I encountered had the same thin cashmere sweaters I did and the same lightweight eyeglasses. Some of us had the same skin tone from the same foundation. We complained of the same back problems induced by the same memory foam mattresses. In apartments decorated with the same furniture and painted the same shades of security deposit white, we placed the same ceramic planters holding the same low-maintenance plants. Efficiency, the central value of software, was the consumer innovation of a generation. Silicon Valley might have promoted a style of individualism, but scale bred homogeneity. Venture-funded, online-only, direct-to-consumer retailers had hired chatty copywriters to speak to the affluent and overextended, and we appeared to be listening. The direct-to-consumer companies sold cotton t-shirts, toothbrushes, rubber trees, rash cream, skin cream, leather bags, meal replacements, luggage, linens, contact lenses, cookies, hair dye, athleisure, wristwatches, vitamins. On any given night in America, exhausted parents and New Year's resolution cooks were unpacking identical cardboard boxes shipped by meal prep startups, disposing of identical piles of plastic packaging, and sitting down to identical dishes. Homogeneity was a small price to pay for the erasure of decision fatigue. It liberated our minds to pursue other endeavors, like work. Persuaded by the testimonials of two infrastructure engineers, overnight converts to orthotic sensibility, I ordered a pair of unembellished monochrome merino wool sneakers. I'd been noticing them on people in coffee shops and in line at no-cash food trucks and in advertisements on my social media feeds. The sneakers looked like a child's drawing of a shoe distilled to its essence, but they were incredibly comfortable. I didn't know if wearing them outside was an act of radical self-respect or the exact opposite. They sat unworn by the apartment door, a monument to the end of sensuousness. So I probably should have said before I started reading that was about this feeling that everything was beginning to have this sense of optimization, of streamlining, of everything was starting to feel generic. And to me, that mirrored the feeling of software, the way that, you're expected to have these homogeneous platforms that can hold all sorts of different types of content, but actually the content, I think, tends to fit into the form of the platforms, which is why you have certain, like, what might be generously described as literary forms emerging on Instagram or tones or anyway. So that was meant to gesture toward the influence of software on the physical environment.
It's interesting because by that point in the book, and it's quite a lot further along in the book, you are very weary of that aesthetic that's kind of nurtured by tech. But to me, when you read the first excerpt, those people are just as homogenous, right? I mean, it's the same people, but you were really excited about it.
Right. Right, and it's not.
Do you think it
Valley
got
didn't
worse
invent
in
mass
that time,
fashion.
or had you just been around it longer?
I think it was no longer novel, and in the span of the book, from the first section to what I just read, I had just grown incredibly disillusioned. I feel like a part of that had to do with the gap or the distance between the narratives that I had been sold on and had been telling myself and what I was actually experiencing. And just at a certain point, those became incompatible. And I think that The people I was working with, I wouldn't call them homogenous, but I would say that there are obviously different like subcultural affiliations that people have. I just think what tech tends to promote, or what a lot of these direct-to-consumer companies tend to promote, is this idea of like a streamlined, minimalist existence that leans heavily on generics with amazing branding and like really nice fonts. And that to me seems to represent the sort of enthusiasm for scale and for simplicity, and maybe the values of like frictionless user experience design. Am I getting a little heady? Sorry.
No, I love it. I mean, it also seems to be part of the theme of kind of belonging, like wanting to belong, which I think goes through the book, but also then once you're able to belong, being like, this is really oppressive. I feel like that's something that's not unique to a tech memoir, but it comes out in this memoir because the aesthetic of tech is so defined. And it's also so new, like you're describing it kind of as it's forming.
Well, the aesthetic is new, but a lot of what's happening in the industry isn't new at all. It's just sort of, I mean, I think the industry is incredible at storytelling and at branding and repackaging. Yeah. And that's like maybe what it is. It's like tech, Silicon Valley is just like Wall Street runoff capital. This is not like a new, growth, new form of capitalism. If anything, it's just sort of like accelerated, amplified capitalism.
Yeah.
And in the same way, a lot of the products are, have long-running predecessors. I mean, this
like
idea,
shoes. Those shoes you described.
Yeah, have you heard
just
of
buy
sneakers?
those in a store.
And I'm not quite sure where I was going with this. I'm so sorry. I got excited.
Well, the thing that seems different is that the culture that surrounds it, to me, does seem new. Like the office culture that you describe, and the way that consensus seems to form in the office is so close. That seems, and the kind of flat hierarchy, so everyone is sort of, no one is above anyone else except the CEO, even though they actually are. Like the fictions that it seemed to me you and your co-workers would buy into seem almost unique to this kind of company, like to tech companies or companies that are more traditional companies but are trying to act more like tech companies.
Yeah, I mean, something like a flat hierarchy just means that there's a shadow hierarchy, that there's a hierarchy that exists that is not transparent, and so you never know who's making decisions about what, and who's making decisions about you or your career. I think part of what makes the culture at these startups especially unusual is the youthfulness. And it's very strange when you're surrounded by other people who are, 2 years older or younger than you are, and everyone's under the age of 30. So like is that a workplace, or is that like a adult interest group? Like it's like having like joining a kickball league that plays in the Karen Park or something. So I think you end up having these really weird power struggles where there's also a social element. You're spending so much time together. You're socializing. Everyone's smart and motivated, ambitious, whatever. It's fun to hang out, but also that creeps into the work itself and to the power dynamics in the office. So I think that that's a big part of the belonging, right? It feels amazing to belong, but I think also, especially as a woman, like you never really belong.
Right.
You're constantly having to prove that you belong, and it's never smooth sailing. So I think that acceptance, especially when you're being accepted by people who've been rewarded by the industry so dramatically and so abundantly, it feels like you're getting closer to not just power, but like genius.
So that thing about belonging also keys into a question I wanted to ask about the way you chose to write this book. It's a memoir, it's about your experience, but it also seems to me to be about a lot of other people's experience. Like a lot of the time you're talking about like me and my co-workers, like the way you fall into lockstep with these different groups of people at each stage of your journey through tech. And in some ways that confers a lot more responsibility on you than if this was a memoir of just you kind of doing your thing and going on your journey.
My journey. A memoir.
That's actually Tony Blair's book. So I'm glad you didn't write that.
The memoir is a weird memoir. I initially had this really pretentious conceit that I would write a book about surveillance in which the narrator disappears. And my editor very gently told me that that's not a memoir.
That sounds like a novel, a really good novel.
But I do feel in many ways that I'm the least important part of this story. I think that my observations are useful, or I hope that they are useful. But my hope was that, like your Everlane t-shirt or your Allbirds sneakers, that my presence was sort of generic, like that I could move through this world and be sort of an avatar for other people in a way. So it is a personal story. There is a lot of personal stuff in it for me, for my threshold of disclosure. But I think that there's also something that happens at these companies, or at least happened for me, but that I think is fairly common, which is that your identity gets bound up with the identity of the company. And so you're working toward a collective interest. And I don't mean that in a comrade way. I mean that in like a, pretty corporate down for the cause kind of way. And so I think that this feeling of this sort of choral voice is trying to gesture at this feeling of belonging and of this in-group status that is also quite tenuous, right? I mean, it falls apart quite quickly. It sort of drops down to an I, sorry.
Right. And of course, there are also stories of individuals that come out of this. Like, there are a few named characters in the book, and then there are people who are like the CEO or the CTO. Have any of them read the book? Have they told you what they think about it?
Some of them have, yes. People have been very supportive in their way. And I will say that that's one of the things that's nice about tech culture, is that people are incredibly supportive of each other's
there are no bad
successes
ideas
and failures. So I haven't heard from everyone in the book. The naming scheme, I don't name companies either, and my hope for that was to suggest that I name friends, and I name friends basically. And but executives and founders and companies, to me, I felt in a lot of ways doesn't matter. The products are important, what they did, and they're specific to my experience, but I did feel that a lot of these experiences, the companies were interchangeable, that what was happening to me at this particular startup was probably happening to someone else 2 blocks away in Soma. So same with executives, I feel that often people are responding to external pressures, and that's not to exonerate them of any moral responsibility or personal responsibility, but more so to say that I think a lot of the behaviors that I saw or experienced from people in executive roles or leadership roles probably would have emerged from any number of people in that same position.
Right. And it also seemed like, at least from my reading of this, some of the CEOs you worked with were actively modeling themselves on other CEOs, like they're trying to replicate that kind of behavior. So we don't necessarily need to know which CEO, who's who.
Something really freaked me out the other day. Someone had read an early copy of my book and texted me and was like, there's a scene in which our manager pulled my team into a room and said, who are the 5 smartest people that you know? Write their names down. And we all wrote their names down. And then he said, look at your list. Why don't they work here? And so for me, that was like the hubris of this company. Like, this is wild. Like, my friends don't want to work here because they have other interests. And this is not the most important thing a person can do, despite the pervasive belief in Silicon Valley that the most useful thing a person can do is work for a startup and circumvent your social responsibility instead of engaging with society. So I had put this in the book, and a friend texted me who had worked at a very different type of startup, and she was like, this is so surreal. They must have all gotten that off a blog post or something, because this happened to me too. She'd been pulled into a room and asked to write down the 5 names of the smartest people she knew. And so I think that a lot of people are learning on the job as they're growing up. As starting a company at 20, you are like developing your moral reasoning at the same time as you are figuring out how to be an executive. And I do have sympathy for that. But I also don't think that, I have sympathy for people in that position. I don't think they should be in that position in the first place. I think it's extremely irresponsible. We can get into that another time or in the book. But you have people learning to be executives at the same time they're learning to be adults. And a lot of the material they're reading comes from venture capitalists, comes from economists, comes from the sort of like boostery business writers who post on Medium, 3 ways to develop empathy in under 15 minutes.
And then the flip side of that is that the employees are also learning how to deal with the boss at the same time. And my favorite story in the book was of your friend trying to get a raise and the memo that he wrote. Can you just tell that?
Oh, it's a little hard to get into the details. The details are in the book. Yeah, a friend of mine, I mean, this is, okay, but this speaks to the sort of everyone feeling that their identity is the company and the company is them. A friend of mine who'd been at the company for a year, was an early employee, maybe employee 8 or something like that. Instead of negotiating for a raise, gave an ultimatum that was effectively, I want 1% of the company and like autonomy from the CEO, or I'm going to leave. I'll take these talents elsewhere. And it was sort of like the sort of collective action you would hope to see in the tech industry now, but on the individual scale, and so it didn't work. But in his defense, there was no negotiation. Like an experienced manager would say, this may be one of your first jobs, but the way to ask for a raise and a title boost is not to offer an ultimatum. It's not to ask to be fired, it's to negotiate. And so I think both parties were I don't know, I wasn't there in the meetings, but I think there was a sort of mutual panic at
but it seemed like one person read another Medium post on like how to get like think big and like ask for something really unrealistic because you might get it. And then the other person like didn't read a post on how to respond to that and was just like, you know what, dude, like we're done here.
The answer is to read everything that's posted on Medium.
Okay, well on that note, I think it's time for some questions from the audience. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, and a microphone will be coming round.
So in the book, you don't use any of the names of the companies. I know you said something about how you wanted it to feel like interchangeable, but is there any reason that you did that? Was that like stylistic or was that like legal?
Where does one end and where does one begin, really? It was stylistic. Yeah, it's not a secret where I worked. It's incredibly easy to Google. Shockingly easy to Google.
So like what were you trying to make happen with that stylistic choice, I guess?
I wanted to point to the interchangeability of these companies and people in these positions. I didn't really think it mattered what the names were. I also, I think it's helpful to remember what these companies do or what their role in society is or how they're perceived. Like the social network that everyone hated, which is a shorthand for Facebook, is not a description of what Facebook does. That would be like a surveillance, it would be like an ad network with social features. But that was how Facebook felt in this time. It was like everyone who I knew who had an account hated it, but they felt that they couldn't extricate themselves from it. And I think that Facebook has exhibits qualities of a monopoly, and it's useful to remember that these are not just inevitable products, but like in many cases loathed. And so that was my ambition. And also I don't like the names of these companies. I think they're silly and condescending and make it harder for people to take the work seriously. So off my soapbox on that, sorry. It's a good question, thank you.
So I wanted to ask about, there's this one section in the book where you talk about the prospects of unionizing at the third company you work at. And now, of course, there's all these sort of scandals happening in unionizing in tech at Kickstarter and also Everlane. And I sort of wonder now that you're out of it, and also the company you're working for right now, I guess you're a contributor to the New Yorker, I don't know if you're a full staff member, they're having their own union drive. I sort of just wonder your general thoughts on like sort of unionization in tech, but also maybe also that larger need for unions around these precarious industries? Precarious workers.
I think I can probably speak best to tech, just to stay in my lane, I guess. I am very excited by the prospect of collective action inside these companies, and I am encouraged that people are talking about it more. I think there's probably more happening than is surfacing in the media. I don't know that it necessarily has to look like a union. I think that can be really daunting, especially in an industry where people move around quite a bit. You know, you do 18 months at a company and then you move on to the next, sort of collecting your like equity bundle. But I do, so I guess what I mean by that is not to dismiss unionizing. I think that could be incredibly useful. But to say that there are all these other smaller actions that people could take inside of companies that could be really, that could have a serious impact in a positive way. So whether that is, I don't know. I think we're in a moment where tech workers have incredible leverage that's just not being used, and I don't think that's going to happen. That's going to last forever. I wouldn't call tech a precarious industry for full-time workers. Obviously, contractors for these companies are in far more precarious situations and are often exploited in a lot of ways, or in these other outside contractor companies that aren't even dealing directly with something like Google or Facebook. But sorry, all of which is to say, I am pro collective action, pro unionization, and I think if it's going to happen, it needs to happen quickly, because this is not going to last forever. This feeling that employees have a lot of leverage, I don't think it's tenable, and I think that there are, a lot of the excitement around machine learning and around coding boot camps is also a conversation about labor and building out that labor pool so that it's not so expensive or difficult to hire and retain engineering talent, or perhaps necessary at all if the technology gets sophisticated enough. So I would say probably unionizing is, for similar reasons in more precarious industries, an essential way for people to find stability in their workplace. But tech is just one area I've thought more about. And to be more specific, sorry, just because I do think this is important, and I don't talk about it a ton in the book. And in the book, I sort of let someone else have the last line on it. I think this can look like 6 people going to a founder of a company and saying, we have this misogynistic asshole running our team, we're all going to quit, or we're all going to go to the media unless this person leaves. And that can work. That works really well, and that's 6 people in a company of hypothetically 300. So I think that I find stories like that very encouraging. Is that optimistic? I don't know. I got excited.
Hey, so you hinted that tech workers didn't really engage with society, and so I just wanted to ask you, what does that mean to you, and how do you think people should engage?
I don't think tech workers don't engage with society. I think that a lot of the business models of these companies are oriented towards circumvention rather than engagement. So a lot of what disruption is sort of upending an incumbent. And I guess where that alarms me is not so much disrupting the data space. I mean, this has always been a largely unregulated industry. There are a lot of problems there. For me, it's when you see something like education alternatives, coding boot camps, or online unaccredited schools where you're not even necessarily getting a certification, and they're being touted as an alternative to education, and touted as an alternative to student debt. And the issue there is student debt. The issue isn't the value of an education. The issue is that I think that that's a shortcut often to a high-paying job for people to learn how to code, sorry, to be clear. Is a shortcut for people, and that can boost someone, up to class brackets in a matter of, one job transition. And that's a wonderful thing, but it is still locates the responsibility on the individual, and it seems to disengage or divest from any sort of social commitment. And so for me, that's what I'm talking about. It's more about the incentives of the business model, not so much like the individual workers themselves.
Just a quick follow-up. Do you think business is a good way to engage, could be a good way to engage with society?
It's a really good question that I only have like reductive answers to on the spot. I'm also looking at someone who just went to business school. I think business can be really useful. I think there are. I don't think it's in the interest of a business to be good for society. That's not what the incentives are. And so I think that businesses can donate excess cash to groups that are doing good work for society, but it's not the responsibility of a business, and it's not necessarily in their interests. And so I would hesitate to answer that in the positive, and that's okay. But I think that when it comes to talking about Silicon Valley, these companies have, for a very long time, talked about changing the world and making things better for people and making this the most exciting and best time to be alive. And I think it would be a lot more honest to start from a position of just acknowledging that these are businesses and they're operating under the incentives of capitalism. And if they were, in many cases, thinking about platforms, especially like Amazon or Facebook, Google, I mean, you all know the companies, that to operate responsibly and in a way that would be probably broadly understood as good for society would completely demolish the business model, that they could not exist if they were ethical corporate actors. So it's hard for me to think about what a business that is oriented toward being good for society would be. But if you have an example, I would be very curious to hear it.
Yeah, I would love to talk after this.
It's a company called Deloitte.
Okay, well, so I want to finish with the one last question that I personally was left with. Right, I don't think there's another question there, which is, in the interview for your first job in Silicon Valley, they asked you how you would describe the internet to a medieval farmer, and you've had years to figure this one out. Like, what's the answer?
You're not the first person to ask me this, and it's so humiliating. I can't do it. I just refuse. I just reject this. I finally have the confidence to say no and walk away from the situation.
Okay. I respect that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks so much for talking to us. Yes, clap now, and then I'll tell you to buy books. And thank you all for coming. Books are on sale. Anna will be signing them, so make sure you get one. And come back to our next event at the Strand, which will be in February, talking to Andre Asselman.
Thank you, Laura.
Thanks.